I'll just run through some examples. This is a tapestry done in around that time, sometime in the 1800s, not sure. But just keep in mind, this is there's different artists in this movement, and they were doing tapestry, they were doing paintings, they were doing furniture. Here's an example of some furniture.
Nice.
One of the goals of the Pre-Raphaelites was to what do you think the name would come from? Pre-Raphaelite. What would you think of when you hear that? Where'd they get the name?
Somebody who came before the Raphaelites. That's silly, but yes.
Who are the Raphaelites?
I don't know. I don't know.
What artist do you think of when you hear Raphaelite?
Raphael.
Yeah. Okay, so
More like 14th or 15th century Italian, though, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So they I don't know why they chose him. Is they felt that there's a group of artists who felt that every Raphael on after him that art went in the wrong direction. They wanted to get back to where what was happening in the medieval period in the 1400s, right? And so this piece of furniture would be something you'd see in the medieval Europe.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know why they chose Raphael. Raphael, I think, is very similar to some of their work. I don't know why they,
Yeah.
Well, either probably somebody loved his paintings, or I mean, you know.
well, his style is very colorful, very realistic, which is similar to theirs. So I don't know why they didn't like Raphael, but
Well, I do have something to say about that, but do you want me to say it now or later?
I'll say it now.
Because these painters, they were only like 18 or 19 years old and still students when they named themselves in this movement. And they hadn't traveled. They only had seen whatever art was available to them in museums in London. And so I think they just had a misconception about what was.
Yeah, that's good. I didn't know that. Thanks. Because I think if they had seen Raphael's best work, they would have liked to approve it. But actually, it was the art that post-Renaissance art, the Baroque art that they really had.
Yes.
Not so much the Renaissance art. I mean, so all right. Here's a good example of Pre-Raphaelite. Just any comments, any thoughts to that? What you think? What your untutored opinions? And this whole topic today, Cheryl, should be more easier on your eyes, because I know you have. I'm just teasing you, but
You know,
I know some of the abstract painters have had difficulty with. So you should be easy. But anyway, this a little side there. Go ahead.
it's very beautiful. It's clear. I can see it really clearly. I don't have a problem with my eyes. I'm watching this on my computer, and sometimes just whatever. It's not my eyes. It's like
No, I was speaking metaphorically.
Okay,
I didn't
but
mean that.
maybe I do have a problem with my eyes, but it's not seeing the concrete world. It's like what I'm looking at is the problem. No, this is beautiful. Thank you.
It looks very romantic,
Yeah, and
very dreamlike. It's not real. It's what one would like. Looks like King Arthur's time.
right. Okay. So
But
maybe,
I'm wondering, Joe, you've talked a lot about balance. I was just thinking this, I love it actually, but if you're talking about balance, I don't see that this painting is balanced.
not balanced in what way? What's unbalanced to that?
Well, she seems so huge in relation to the small window. Well, the candles and the candlestick are pretty large.
Hmm,
I don't know, it just,
I don't know. I don't get that. I mean, it seems proportions seem pretty correct. I mean, she's the featured. But the it's kind of mythological in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's keep that in mind. That's an element of the Pre-Raphaelites.
Yeah.
Drawing on
And
mythology. Yeah.
also the different types of flowers that are depicted here, that one in the glass,
Yeah.
and then what looks like climbing roses behind her, and then the ones on the desk.
That's the other thing they do is the symbolism over here in the narrative.
Right.
Nearby flowers symbolize different kinds of love.
Uh-huh.
So you do see, particularly flowers have symbolic meaning, and many of them drew on that. So, all right.
Also incredible detail, like in the hair.
Yeah.
And in the painting of the what looks like lace on the dress.
That's the other use of glazes, and also going into great detail was another one there, which certainly the Renaissance painters did. Raphael did that, so it's not like they're doing anything original. But this reminds me a little bit of a Renoir, doesn't it?
And why?
The flesh tones, yeah.
Renoir. I wonder if he was influenced by them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
There look like a couple more, and then get into most of them. Pre-Raphaelites were men. There was a couple of women. J. Morris was one of them.
For Mariana. Are you saying these were all British artists?
Yeah, they were British. This happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it spread overseas, but it didn't last that long. 1848 was when they started, and it's hard to keep a group of artists together under one umbrella, being they're so independent. They started having friction and going different ways. So the movements maybe lasted 40, 50 years at the most, but it just went off in different directions.
Well, that might be as long as most of them lasted. Period, before they died.
Yeah, but they started having their differences about what they wanted.
Yeah.
To do. Yeah. So I'm trying to think, what she just read is painted. Okay. And the other one is Rosetti. I forget her first name. The daughter of Dante Rossetti, who's one of the main founders. Oh, and I gotta go backwards here. So this would be a pretty good example of a Pre-Raphaelite painting. What do you see there? What does it remind you of?
for me, it sort of seems like a tapestry, like it reminds me of tapestries. From that same time period, the medieval tapestries, like the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah, the poses are
The castles.
kind of
Flowers, the lighting,
stylistic poses.
the animals in the background, although they usually have, unicorns and deer and other animals running in front in the tapestries, but or throughout.
And there's that figure on the left is wearing some kind of armor, it looks like.
Yeah, so that's right back to the.
So it could be Arthurian or something, some kind of legend or myth.
Yeah.
They said it's a feeling of a medieval fair, or suggestions of the Italian Renaissance. And then these classic young women, classic shapes of facial features that are stylized in a way.
The song that inspired.
Which is like medieval art.
Yeah.
And the figure on the right looks like an angel because there are wings.
There are.
One.
Earth and
Are there wings? Oh yeah, right. There are wings in the back. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, little wings.
Right. And this is, what is this here, this object? It's like a confessional thing? Is she saying her confession? Or what
No,
is-
that's that's a sort of a, no,
It's
no,
it's
An
an
instrument.
instrument.
yeah.
Oh,
It's
okay.
like a
Yeah.
piano, but a movable one, like a lap piano, but there's a specific name for it, except this one's on a
Okay.
beautifully carved wooden stand,
Harpsichord?
like organ pipes or piano pipes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Days.
And the other thing is just the rich colors in
Yeah.
Venetian art in the Renaissance. Titian really
Yeah.
like these royal the reds and greens. So these are their love of color was harks back to Venice.
Yeah, yeah.
So let me think. Yeah, it evolved into decorative arts,
Oh, yeah.
which was, I guess, wallpaper or
Yeah, William Morris.
William Morris.
You just said the words I was going to. Thank you. Yeah, William Morris. That whole time span. Yeah,
Right.
very romantic.
Turn a room into a flower. So that
Yeah.
was one of the directions it went into the decorative arts for home
Yeah.
design. Pink and rose. So what they say here is in 1848, as revolution swept Europe, an uprising for social reform known as Chartism unsettled Britain. Seven rebellious young artists from in London formed a secret society with the aim of creating a new British art. They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Okay. Disenchanted with contemporary academic art, which had become very formal
Yeah.
and dark, often use of dark colors. So that's what they were reacting against. The
Mhm.
Brotherhood emulated the art of the late medieval and early Renaissance Europe until the time of Raphael. An art characterized by minute description and detail, a luminous palette of bright colors that recalls the tempera pate used by medieval artists, and subject matters of a noble, religious, or moralizing nature. They initially said they wanted to do that. Art had gotten away from spiritual mission and spiritual themes. They wanted to bring spirituality back into art. But then it got into mythology and also Shakespeare. Their paintings that would be from Shakespeare's plays, etc. So they didn't just stay in Christian or Catholic religious ideas. And there was also there was the initial phases of mass industrialization, and it was pretty awful. And I think that's when London started to become a really horrible place, and they were. So, and at the same time, the Romantic period was starting to flourish. So it was definitely part of Romanticism. So, yeah. And they had like the Impressionists, there was critical opposition to their compositions,
Yeah.
their absence of shadows, flattened the depicted forms. You know, in Renaissance, early Renaissance art, medieval art, the forms are flat. They're not rounded, fleshy figures. So they were harking back to that. It's the stark coloration. So anyway, they were criticized for that. But now, you know, John Ruskin, the famous art critic, he liked them and spoke highly of them, so that helped their cause. Okay. So maybe you've heard this, some of the famous names, Dante, Rosetti, Edward Burne-Jones, William Morris, right, some of the names. So they got into stained glass, furniture, textiles, jewelries, wool coverings, all inspired by botanical motifs. Right? Yeah. So that in the 1800s in England, a movement to unify the arts came about, known as the arts and crafts, took root in
Yes.
and by the century's end was flourishing throughout the British Isles.
Yes.
Yeah. You can almost see some of the precursors of Art Deco in this too, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, right? Can you see that?
Yes.
How they may have been influenced.
King Arthur. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's look at some of these people. Waterhouse is another one.
Weren't there also authors and poets at that time who were sort of in this whole thing, and
Yeah.
a lot of
John Keats,
romanticism and
yeah, John Keats.
What-
Wordsworth,
questioning
yeah,
moral structure and trying to change that, perhaps.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
Gaelic poets, John Keats, Wordsworth, etc.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So this is what's his name? Waterhouse.
Waterhouse. I don't know Waterhouse.
So these are very. So just your thoughts on that.
I like that. You know, she's almost a whirling dervish,
Yeah.
which would be Sufi.
What do you think she's feeling? What emotions are being expressed? What do you get from her?
Sadness.
Why?
The expression on her face. She's looking down. She's not smiling. She seems to be clutching herself.
Yeah.
I think it's more fear, and she's trying to
Right.
hold herself around.
Yeah, it looks like some strong wind or gale is coming up, right? And
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think she's fearful of something.
yeah. So
Mhm.
maybe it's like there's a metaphor, like the strong wind might be a metaphor for a strong emotional storm coming through
Yeah.
her
Yeah,
that she's been through. So I think it's one of the things they do, that they through that nature can reflect our emotional states. So and she's kind of like maybe looking for, it's almost like a womb, going back into the womb or something, right?
yeah,
The maternal,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That the way her cape has the shape
Yeah.
is shaken. Yeah, so that's what I get from looking at her. She's maybe she just had some romantic trauma. Maybe her split up with her boyfriend.
Yes.
She got gone through. I don't know. Some loss, and then
Yeah.
the color of her whatever it is, a cape or something, is
Yeah, a shawl.
the shawl. It's sort of the gray violet. It's kind of this almost a sad color. And that permeates the whole painting. You know,
Yeah.
the darks. Yeah. So, but this is a quintessential pre-Raphaelite painting. And yet within all that, you could say, I mean, you easily say it's beautiful, right? This is,
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. The Lady of Shalat. Didn't someone make who did that song? Did someone made a song, The Lady of Shalat? What's her name?
Probably more than one person, but Lorena McKennitt did it.
Lorena McKenna. That's right. Yeah, she did.
Can you tell me what the story is? Who is the Lady of Shalat?
Good
She
question.
obviously was an important character because here she is, not only in music but in painting. So
Yeah,
what does she represent? I never could get it from.
I don't know. Could someone look it up quickly so I don't go off the page? I'd have
Oh,
to go.
never mind. Never mind.
Maybe just get a quick.
I thought somebody might
Lady
know.
of Shalat. Was that like from
Wasn't
King
it
Arthur?
King Arthur, I think, Lady of Shalott.
Because
Yeah, I think it's
Lancelot looked at her
No.
and says,
Here,
get on
the-
her.
Let's Jill found it.
The Lady of Shalott is a lyrical ballad by the English poet Alfred Tennyson.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Yeah.
And it tells this tragic story of Elaine of Astolat, a young noblewoman stranded in a tower up the river from Camelot.
I knew Camelot.
So it's medieval romanticism, enigmatic symbolism, and it's inspired many painters, especially the pre-Raphaelites.
Well, she ends up being dead. The mirror cracks. She's knitting and she looks out her window and watches lovers go by. And I remember this from Lorena McKennitt's song. And then all of a sudden, and I couldn't get why, the mirror cracks and she says, my fate is sealed. And she gets in her boat and drifts down the river and she's dead. And as she goes by, Lancelot, who's by the river, says, but God in his mercy gave her a lovely face.
Right.
So I was just wondering what she represented. That's why I was
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shalat.
And all, you know, these beautiful young women in their 20s, their favorite topic in the Pre-Raphaelites, these kind of there's an ideal kind of beauty, maybe like Italian beauty, you know, the periods.
But it seems that she's loveless. I mean, she doesn't have
Yeah.
a knight to
Exactly.
carry
Yeah.
her kerchief.
They're forlorn for one reason or another. So maybe she's about to drown or something. Yeah. But the skill, the painting skill, this technically, it's a very high level, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. And it's they were very accomplished artists. So he was,
And a lot of inclusion of these natural settings.
Yeah.
With painted in great detail, and that was something that John Ruskin really emphasized, was this immersion in nature and an observation of nature.
Greek myths, they would do Hylas in the myths, right? Lucky guy. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Party time.
7 beautiful naked women. All right. What's he doing? Nice. He's talking to one of them.
He's thinking he might go in and join them.
Yeah, exactly.
So she's thinking that.
He's pulling him in.
Yeah, she's pulling him. So I don't know what the story. There must be a story that goes with this pilot thing. Maybe he wanted. I don't know. But that blues really jumps out at it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And there's blue throughout. There's shades of blue, gray blues, and green. So it's very on the cool side. The only you can't really say the skin is warm, but it's white. But it's a very cool, earthy painting with just one slash of red there, which jumps out. Yeah. Red and green complementary colors. They like using red and green. But notice how that red jumps out when you have the complement green. The complement is grayed down. It's not a vivid green. It's just if you want a color to pop, you put it. You surround it by its complement that's toned down. So here's.
I just looked this up, and apparently this Hylas has been enraptured by the naiads, and they are abducting him.
Oh, okay. Hey,
Lucky guy.
Lucky guy.
Good for them.
Someone adopt me. Here's a mermaid. Look at that. Wow.
Guy.
So you can see they've compared to what the classical style, this kind of stiff portraits, the heavy use of black, and in the salons that were the trend back then that they were rebelling against. So it was really a refreshing movement. I mean,
Yes.
it's and it continues to influence modern art.
Who did the Mermaid?
Same guy, Waterhouse.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll go to someone else after this one. What's the story here? Destiny.
Destiny.
Okay, so looks like could have been this 1500s or 1600s, like ships. These are kind of ships you see that were like Magellan or Columbus. You see the globe here, which suggests exploring the globe. It's like a window back into time in a way. Some books here, but what is she doing? She's drinking. What's that have to do with anything? I'm not sure. Anybody have any thoughts
They're
on that?
coming together.
They're what?
They're coming together to take her away.
No, they're coming together, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. What's she drinking? I don't know. Is it just wine?
Something to make her
Destiny.
destiny.
Right? Yeah. Not sure. Blue and orange are complementary colors. So there's another study in complements. See how the blue jumps out, surrounded by gray, sort of toned down orange. Orangey. All right, so that's Waterhouse. How about Edward Burns Jones?
Oh, I know him.
Ooh, isn't that beautiful?
Yeah,
They're so young,
yeah,
so innocent.
yeah, that's part of their art. They're always
Yeah,
they're painting youthful dreams and romantic
yeah.
and capturing that magic. Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's kind of the very, I mean they're tapping into some a sense of beauty that's ingrained. I think it's easy to appreciate, you know, flowers and young
Mhm.
people and beautiful, beautiful colors. I mean, look at, I mean, this was built up on layers. That's a very, that blue there in her
Mm.
gown is really, really beautiful. Um, yeah. This one is most expensive Pre-Raphaelite ever sold at that. This one, I guess, is paying. I don't know how much it sold for.
You think that could be a mother and a son?
Mm-mm.
No?
No,
Okay,
no, she's too young.
okay.
Yeah. That's very early Renaissance-y looking, isn't it?
Get the
Yeah,
sleeves.
crystal ball on the sleeves. That looks like it's right out of the early 1400s. So.
Yeah.
And here, so like our early Dutch look to it. What's the name of this one? Couldn't say, but yeah, okay. So she's longing to get out in the world, feeling trapped behind whatever domestic or social expectations they did. Um, Here he is. The John Ruskin. Yeah, and then they did these very Renaissance. He did looking panels, look like came right out of
Yeah.
a church from the 1400s. But they're doing it uniquely. It's not, they're not just copies. You know, if you look at them in detail, you see that they're modernized.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Lucy Maddox. Um, so there's very few women, of course, because women didn't have opportunities to paint, but she's one of Lucy Maddox Breno.
Hmm.
Boy, she's good.
Yeah, the tombs.
Mm.
No more, I'm gonna move this.
Oh,
Yuck. Thanks.
But what is it? It's in the basket. Crabs?
It's a head of somebody.
Oh, it's a head.
oh
Oh, there.
yeah.
There's
Yeah.
the head. I said that looked like a crab. Yeah, okay, it's a head. Yeah.
Oh my God.
I don't know what the story is here.
That
Margaret Roper rescuing the head of her father. Oh, it's even worse.
Oh, gee.
There must be some story. Maybe it was in the newspaper. Look at that one.
Oh.
The magic mirror. Yeah, right in the last one. You can see where this led to children. Who was it the book illustrator, the American 1960s.
Oh, you mean,
What's his name?
yeah, I know his name.
It's right on the tip of my tongue, but you can see the
Mhm.
influence, right? What's his name? Anyway, it might come to
It'll come to me in a minute.
Right.
I was just thinking about him because when I saw the Mermaid,
yeah.
that reminded me of one of his paintings.
Yeah, there's a well-known book illustrator who did these medieval or magical romantic themes.
Oh.
Can't think of his name. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
Lucy Maddox Brown.
Maddox Brown.
If I can get, let's say here on there's a better page for him. So he was one of the founders. Dante, Gabriel, Rosetti. He was one of the founders.
Gabriel, Rosetti.
And,
Oh,
Fantastic. It's these rich, potent.
that's the same one we looked at earlier, right? So
Yeah.
it's a more vivid color. Look at the details in her hair. Look how it's,
yeah.
and then often scenes of outdoors or the outdoor coming indoors. We'll see when we look at what
Mhm.
it is. The Girlhood of Virgin Mary. And, things are out of proportion. Books are big, person here is big, she's small. So playing around with perspective and composition and proportions. Don't know why, but that's an interesting one. Prosper Peen. This is one of his best known work. Portrays the titular Roman goddess as the emperor of Hades in a gloomy contemplative pose, following her abduction to the underworld by Pluto, and then to be his wife. Right?
I only see like the bottom of the picture.
Yeah, I know. I'm reading this. The
Oh,
painting
okay.
is often said to
Okay.
be an allegory for Jane's unhappy marriage. Right. There you go.
Howard Pyle.
Howard Pyle. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, Howard Pyle. Who is his children or who?
Howard Pyle taught a whole bunch of artists,
Right.
including N.C. Wyeth.
N.C. Wyeth, right? Yeah, okay. Wyeth. Yeah. That's what I thought. So there's, medieval. There's the halo, definitely medieval-looking painting, but telling a modern story. Ooh, look at that.
Could I see that one again? The one right above?
This one?
So in so many of these, we're seeing that window motif.
Yeah, exactly.
And opening to the outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
And flowers.
You see that in medieval paintings. There's
Yeah.
the windows. So this, I'm sure this flower, what is it? Has meaning.
Lily?
It's a lily, yeah. So
yeah.
And lily's painted on this red, whatever it is. So lily, the symbolism of lilies. What is the symbolism of lilies?
I think it's purity and peace.
Right.
It's the meaning of my name.
Right. And all the white that they're wearing. So kind of a contradiction. Like there's all this innocence and purity and peace, and yet she looks very adult and going through some adult crisis there. I'm happy about something.
Not happy.
Yeah. Whoa. So this is titled Bocca Baciata. Another one of Rossetti's longtime muses and mistresses, Fanny Cornlaw, flame-haired beauty, other highly sensual work by the artist. Okay. Written on the back of the painting is a line from the 14th century Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio. The mouth that has been kissed loses not its freshness, still it renews itself even as does the moon. Okay.
She doesn't look like she's too happy though.
No, none of these women are happy, are they?
No.
No, but they all have incredibly strong necks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And paws and bodies in general.
Yeah.
That
And
neck,
hair.
that twisted neck. It's not real. Yeah. But a little bit of, what is that? I guess that's a pomegranate, something to do with the Eve, like the apple. Yeah. It's like the pomegranate and the lips are. The pomegranate probably has symbolism too, right?
Yep.
I'm sure.
About renewal, all the countless seeds in a pomegranate has to do with nature's fecundity. So maybe saying something. There's the window again. Oh, this is another one. This is. This woman committed suicide. It's Lady Lilith. Yeah. According to some myths, she was the first wife of Adam and a seductress and a murderess. Here she is portrayed as an Amazonian beauty in a languidly sensual pose that contrasts with the painting's companion piece. Okay. So it's hard to tell whether she's praying or
I don't think she's praying.
if she's praying.
No.
No. What do you think, Scott? What do you think's going on there?
Probably planning.
It could be she's praying. She's looking up and she has her eyes closed.
It doesn't go with her character.
Yeah, you know.
Well, beata means, like beatific.
Right. Well, this is Lady Lilith. This one.
Yeah.
Oh, stop.
Oh, this one is Lady.
Lady Lilith.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
think
we
so.
don't know for sure. She's definitely introverted, contemplating. There's some strong emotional state that something's happened or about to do something or something awful happened, or else she's meditating. It's hard to tell, I would think. But maybe the symbolism tells something. What is this? A dead what? This bird here? I'm not sure.
It's not dead. It's bringing her a
Oh, it's bringing her
flower,
It's
like
a
a
lot
white
harder.
poppy. It's
That's
and
right.
redness. And look at it, must represent a saint or something because that bird has a halo around its head.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Not a
that's-
dead
yeah,
bird.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
flying and delivering this
Yeah.
flower to her.
Okay. So there's and then there's some kind of saintly figure in the back too. So that's how maybe she's having some kind of beatific vision. Yeah.
Well, if you scroll down and just keep it there for a minute, we can read.
Yeah, it doesn't really tell you.
Spiritual rather than physical beauty is emphasized.
Right.
That's what it says, but that doesn't say much.
Okay. So that's just a little sampling of Rosetti. And I've got some good short videos being sent to anyone else who wants to show. Waterhouse, got the Rosetti. Who's this one? Oh, no, that's right. Okay.
Oof.
Ford Maddox Brown is another one. I think he's one of the originals.
Ford Maddox Brown. He doesn't look like a rebel, but he was one of the pioneering artists of the 19th century. And looking at his work today, it doesn't look particularly rebellious, let's say, but believe me, way back in Victorian Britain, this kind of art form was considered groundbreaking, and he was labelled a radical. So it comes as no surprise that both him and his art are so closely connected to Manchester itself. During the 19th century, the cotton industry transformed Manchester into a modern industrial city. This new commercial prosperity gave some of its residents deep pockets and enlightened artistic taste. The city was among the first to support the Pre-Raphaelite school of art, and was especially appreciative of Brown's brash, artistic palette. So what do we mean when we talk about Pre-Raphaelite art? Well, as the name suggests, it's a style of paintings from the 14th and 15th century, pre the age of Raphael, the great Italian artist. Raphael was the cornerstone of all art academy training, with that wonderful ease of composition and that whole idea of human grandeur. His paintings had an angelic, almost airbrushed feel, and he gave his subjects a sense of serenity and perfection. Well, the 19th century Pre-Raphaelites didn't want any of that. They rebelled against all academic conventions. They challenged the art establishment of the day. They pushed for a reaction. And boy, did they get one. In contrast to their predecessors, Pre-Raphaelite artists celebrated reality and had much more of a brutal style. Ford Maddox Brown was a pioneer of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. He was born in France in 1821, and he was trained in the classical style at various art academies across Europe before finally moving to England and settling in London to begin a career as a painter. It was there that he rejected all of his formal education that embraced classical ideals and instead looked towards earlier Italian art that was influenced by naturalism and the use of bright colours, which he cleverly combined with his own unique style of extremes and expressions. And here is a very simple but good example.
He brought natural-looking sunlight to his pieces and took realism to the extreme. But his reluctance to paint commercially sought-after subjects meant he often struggled to sell his paintings. But as time went on, Brown started to become known as a respected artist, and his luck changed thanks to Manchester Art Gallery. When they bought another of his masterpieces in 1885, the artist's reputation was sealed in the city.
And here it is, it's titled Work, and it's Brown's largest and most ambitious modern life painting. In fact, he called it the work of my life. In its day, this was absolutely groundbreaking. Prior to this, manual workers were depicted as farmers in fields or peasant girls in idolised rustic settings. This is a true slice of Victorian life. There's a group of navvies here digging a sewage system in Hampstead, in London, but there's also a lady here selling chickweed. There's a pastry cook up there, look, delivering something. There's a fruit seller over there. What he's showing is the inherent dignity of the British labourer.
He's chosen his characters to really contrast with each other, to create an allegory about the place of work within society. See here, just look at this, examples of work and idleness, poverty and wealth, and the physical work and the mental work.
And it's here in this magnificent painting you can quite clearly see how Brown has moved away from the academic training he had in his youth. There is clearly no central focal point, so your eye just flits from one character and facial expression to another. And this is arguably one of the greatest works of art of the Victorian period.
Manchester's affection for the artist became even clearer when he was asked to paint 12 murals of the history of Manchester inside here, the new town hall. It took him over 13 years to complete, and he lived in the city for 6 of those years. They were radical, and they set a new agenda for public art. Brown rejected using the great and the good to illustrate noble or heroic acts. Instead, he depicted the past through ordinary men. The people of Manchester loved him for it.
The 12 town hall murals were Brown's last great achievement before his death in 1893. Manchester had given him the opportunity he always wanted. Brown's contribution towards art history is absolutely immense. So the next time you're in the city that embraced him before the masses, take some time out to come and see his masterpieces.
Manchester United.
Go Wolverhampton Wolves.
Yeah, you can see the Impressionists, Monet and others must have been influenced by these people too. Just the use of color, that was so different than what was.
We're in the Tate Britain and we're looking at John Everett Millet's Ophelia. This is the quintessential Victorian and quintessential Pre-Raphaelite painting.
It is, and the Victorians painted Shakespeare quite a lot, and they even painted Ophelia quite a lot, but this is the painting that everybody remembers.
It's that moment after Hamlet has murdered Ophelia's father, and she has let herself fall into this river and is letting herself drown.
Well, she goes mad after Hamlet murders her father and allows herself to drown, And Shakespeare describes the place where that happens, and he describes the flowers and the willow tree. And Millais picks up on that interest in the botanical setting and expands on it.
Well, the botanical specificity. This is an artist who's really taking Ruskin seriously.
Ruskin advised artists to go to nature with singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing.
That is, that nature itself has a kind of spiritual power, and who are artists to mess with God's work?
That's right, but that was the academic tradition, to take from nature and improve on it and to idealize it. That was what, in fact, Reynolds had advised. That's the foundation of the academic tradition.
And so Millais is completely rejecting that. He's going into nature, and he's trying to be as true to what he sees as possible. It's interesting because when we think of painting plein air, that is, when we think of painting outside, we often think of late 19th century French painting. We think of the Impressionists, but of course the Pre-Raphaelites in England were taking this seriously mid-century.
Millais found a spot that was very much like the one that Shakespeare described.
But it's not as picturesque as it sounds. Painting outside is full of frustrations and difficulties. You have insects, you have weather variations, you have animals. And Millais speaks about this with a wonderful sense of sarcasm in a letter that he wrote.
Millais wrote, "I am threatened with a notice to appear before a magistrate for trespassing in a field and destroying the hay. I am also in danger of being blown by the wind into the water and becoming intimate with the feelings of Ophelia when that lady sank to muddy death." This is the funniest part, I think. "There are two swans who not a little add to my misery by persisting in watching me from the exact spot I wish to paint. My sudden perilous evolutions on the extreme bank to persuade them to evacuate their position have the effect of entirely deranging my temper, my pictures, brushes, and palette. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than a hanging."
So we have Millais really clearly at the end of his rope trying to paint this image.
Yeah. The Pre-Raphaelites often show us images of solitary women expressing feelings of longing and frustration and, in this case, madness. The model for this is the woman who would become Rosetti's wife and who was his model and muse, Elizabeth Siddal. And she apparently posed for him in a bathtub that they kept warm with some candles underneath, although she did get sick because the water did eventually get cold.
I know he was quite proud of the dress that he had bought for her to wear, which was already an antique that was embroidered heavily with silver and is beautifully rendered here as it floats and almost becomes like the water weeds that we see around. In fact, this painting was really praised in its day for being perhaps the most faithful to nature in terms of its botanical accuracy. And we can see clearly not only a large willow tree that has fallen and then has regrown. And it's actually wonderful to look at the way that those upturned roots mimic the pose of Ophelia's arms.
And we see lots of flowers that we can identify very specifically.
And that have symbolic purpose.
Right, we see forget-me-nots and poppies, which are a symbol of death, and violets, which are a symbol of faithfulness.
In fact, she's got a chain of violets around her neck, which I think comes directly from the Shakespearean play.
So the symbolic meaning of all of the flowers would have been understood by the Victorian public.
And interestingly, it links all the way back to Shakespeare, who, as you said, is very specific as well about some of the flowers that are mentioned.
So Ophelia floats with her palms upturned. She's not dead yet. Her eyes are open and she seems to be floating down the river. But there are lovely passages when you look closely, not only at the flowers, but especially in the lower left where we see the light moving through those reeds that are growing up in the water. The intensity of the colors and the specificity, both of those things I think would have been really new and rather shocking to the Victorian public.
Well, part of that was achieved because the Pre-Raphaelites rejected the traditional mode of painting, that is, painting on a dark ground. And so instead, they painted on a brilliant white ground, and some of that luminosity really comes through. In addition, some of these artists actually painted not on a dry white ground, but on a ground that was still wet, which meant that that white is picked up by the colors and really creates this vivid luminousness.
And so the Pre-Raphaelites really were revolutionary. We love them now, and they seem very familiar to us, but they seemed really radical back in the late 1840s and 1850s. looking at Millet's The Veil of Rest from 1858 to 59, and this is really Millet's last painting in this pre-Raphaelite style that will go on to become a little bit more academic, a little bit more mainstream after this. We see two nuns, one seated while the other digs a grave in a graveyard.
It's unusual for me to see a nun in such a specific physical activity, for one thing. But the other nun is in opposition to that. She's really at rest. She's looking directly out at us with a very powerful gaze.
The way that she looks out at us with her hands folded, looking very peaceful, almost as though she has accepted death and mortality, and holds a rosary and a cross in her hand, communicating the idea that it's through Christ that one achieves eternal life, that one transcends earthly life. But even though there's that clue to transcendence and eternity here for the human soul, we're still really confronted with the terrible facts of death.
In the vividness of the soil,
yeah,
in the grave,
and the idea
gravestones.
of burial, and we're essentially as viewers standing within the grave.
It's so close to us, it's
Yeah.
true. And there's an interesting way in which the gravestones, the graveyard itself, is really bound, that we're enclosed in this wall. I think one of the things that I find most beautiful about this painting is the really subtle use of light. It's that twilight, it's that moment, right? The sun is fading, creating these really glorious silhouettes for the trees, and also creating this very soft and very complex light on the figures.
Yeah, and it looks very real. You know, you can really remember seeing light that looks exactly like this kind of golden light, and the figures are backlit, and light's coming a little bit from the left, and it almost creates halos.
It does, that's
in
right.
a funny way around their heads.
In some ways, it plays with the color in some really interesting ways. You have those beautiful, very subtle colors in the sky, of course, sort of cool, dark greens versus sort of slightly warmer tones in some of the trees. But then the greens become so vivid in the grass. But there's a kind of almost ethereal quality to the color that seems almost unnatural. And we've all experienced this at twilight.
Where the colors take on a kind of intensity.
Absolutely, but interestingly, it's almost more vivid than in a bright daylight, just because of the tonal contrasts, I think.
So this is, in a way, a kind of modern memento mori. It's not like Masaccio's Trinity, where we have a skeleton reminding us of death. It's connected to a religious painting. This is a secular image that's been transformed into a painting with a spiritual message, reminding us of the passage of time, that death can come at any time to any one of us. In a way, I wonder if it has a more secular message, too. Not so much that we better prepare for our salvation through Christ, but maybe also to enjoy and live life to its fullest while we have it.
So through the beauty and the visual specificity, there's a kind of real connection to the physical world, even though the message is very much about that transition. What I find really brilliant is that here, completely within the industrial world now, within our scientific world, the artist is able to re-imbue a kind of direct physical sense of the spiritual in a way that seems very authentic, that doesn't need any of the artifice of the Renaissance, of the Baroque, but is able to find a kind of spirituality within the modern world.
Comments? Just any comments about their style, their work as a whole, the artists we've looked at?
Well, I'm going to make a different comment, and that is I could feel the air moving through there.
To that last one? Yeah.
Yeah, it was amazing. I've never had that experience before of actually noticing my feeling of air, of the quality of the air moving gently through that space. It's just amazing that how he painted that painting. And then they pointed out all the different colors. I mean, I think that painting is, personally, I feel like it's a great painting.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to get greens right. Greens are the most difficult, I find. Most hard to say that to get them to seem realistic. And so they were really masters at it, because green is throughout since they're painting now in the natural world. It's I'm impressed with how they use green. Anybody else? Here's a good one. I like this one by Malay. It's a short one.
She only said, "My life is dreary, he cometh not," she said. She said, "I am aweary, I would that I were dead."
These are lines from a poem by Tennyson, the great Victorian poet, who had recently been made poet laureate in England just the year before John Everett Millais painted Mariana in 1851.
In turn, Tennyson's poem was based on Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure, and the story is of a woman abandoned by her fiancé for many years, and we see a very typical Pre-Raphaelite subject of a woman alone.
And the painting by Millais seems to me ages away from the original play, Measure for Measure. The story of Mariana is perhaps a serious one, but it's within a play that is a comedy, and yet this painting is completely divorced from that.
And that play has a happy ending. The woman is actually reunited with her fiancé.
And we can't imagine that in this rendering by Millais. So what we see is this woman in this absolutely glorious blue dress who is stretching her back and seems to be in the midst of a kind of terrible melancholy.
She's gotten up from her embroidery, which we get the sense that she's been working on for a very long time. And there's an obvious sense of waiting. I mean, the poem is all about waiting and time passing, and this idea of the passage of time and of a painting expressing a mood or a feeling are two strands that we see a lot in Pre-Raphaelite painting.
There's a heroism of emotion itself as an event that can be painted that is so particular to 19th century British art.
And an inner emotion, a solitary emotion, because before there would be narrative paintings with people enacting emotions toward each other, and here the narrative isn't about Mariana at the moment of her being abandoned by her fiancé, but a moment of waiting. It's a funny moment to paint.
Millais is really brilliant in his ability to create for us a sense of what she thinks and what she sees. She is surrounded in this painting by a set of things to look at, and as we look at them, we imagine her looking at them. We have that intensely rendered embroidery on the table, and then we have those leaves that have fallen that almost look as if they will also be embroidered into that pattern, but they heighten so greatly the sense of melancholy and the sense of loss.
And the sense of the passage of time. Autumn leaves, the passing of the seasons, this idea that this is a space that she occupies year after year with a sense of patient, or maybe even not so patient, waiting.
Those forms, those colors, the things that occupy her visual field are painted so painstakingly.
And the room is small. We only see part of it, but we have a real sense of enclosure and entrapment. She's caught between the stool and the table that she's been working at, and behind her we see an altar, a private devotional space. So we have the sense of her life being taken up between prayer and the meditative work of embroidery and this idea of waiting. We also see a scene of the Annunciation in the window. It's hard for me not to read this as a sense of entrapment of women generally in the Victorian era, in waiting, in sitting, in doing their needlework, in being devout, in a kind of limited life.
And we can see her almost physical strain against that restriction. As she stretches her back, she wants to move out into the world. There really is the sense of bondage there.
Outside, we see the leaves, and we see the ground, and we see light.
Look at Millais' ability to render the textures of the forms that he's depicted. The velvet on that seat cushion and her dress.
And how vivid the reds and the blues and the golds are. It's that Pre-Raphaelite intensity of color that's so different than the colors that a Victorian viewer would see in academic painting.
And it's so clearly based on direct observation as opposed to ideal form. He really went out of his way to make sure that there was a kind of authenticity to what he's rendering.
Well, the mouse on the lower right that we see was actually painted from a dead mouse, apparently, that Millais caught in his studio. And the mouse appears in Tennyson's poem.
And even the stained glass window was painted directly from an actual stained glass window at Oxford University that the artist had climbed up some scaffolding to get a good close look at.
It feels to me as a part of what the painting is about is a tension between nature and art. The leaves from the outside have come in, so we have nature coming inside. We have the stained glass windows, which are art, which look out into nature. There's a confluence of the wallpaper on the wall behind her body and then the leaves outside. She's trapped in an interior in which the exterior seems to have invaded. It feels as though there's some theme there of nature and art and God and the divine.
And as if Her embroidery is artifice that is a representation of the thing that she is yearning to join.
Also, is the life of art, the life of her embroidery, and the life of devotion is not enough. And there's that yearning for more and for love.
I love that painting. You like that painting?
Mhm.
Yeah. That
Yes.
orange crystals, incredible. All right, there's the BBC did a 3 half hour each. I'll show the first one. We'll see how we go. What time is it? 3 o'clock. We got time. Let's see how we feel after the first 30-minute one. Before I started, anybody want to say anything? Any comments, thoughts?
I like that painting. It helps me. It's reminiscence of what we're going through with COVID.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And I did not feel, I feel confined, and I definitely feel tired of COVID. But there's also, I feel a beauty and a serenity and a gratitude for this time, which I picked up in her rather than all that negative stuff the woman was saying.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, she's surrounded by all this beauty. I mean, everything's beautiful, yet her posture was like, she's maybe been sitting for a long time, and so why does he paint her, just with easing her back pain and stretching back, and looking a bit stressed. So that's the contradiction, I guess. Yeah. So those are her thoughts on possible meanings.
The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood brought notoriety to British art in the 19th century. Bursting into the spotlight in the mid-century, they shocked their peers with a new kind of radical art. This programme explores the origins of the Brotherhood, their initial achievements, and the centuries of dogma their paintings overturned. For many, the idea of Pre-Raphaelite art is informed by images of luscious, long-haired women or of sentimental chocolate box children. But the Brotherhood's early work was very different from these later works associated with them. Their first paintings controversially applied a bold new realism to sacred subjects. And then, a decade before the French Impressionists, their brushes captured insalubrious subjects from urban life. Such was the outrage that their work caused, one eminent Victorian dedicated the front page of his magazine to the venting of his disgust.
You behold the interior of a carpenter's shop. In the foreground of that carpenter's shop is a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy in a bedgown who appears to have received a poke in the hand from the stick of another boy with whom he has been playing in an adjacent gutter, and to be holding it up for the contemplation of a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that you would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. Wherever it is possible to express ugliness of feature, limb, or attitude, you have it expressed.
The year was 1850. The critic was the darling of the nation, Charles Dickens, and the painter in question was the 21-year-old Pre-Raphaelite John Everett Millais. His picture, Christ in the House of His Parents, showed Christ in his father's workshop. It was painted to provoke, and it had not failed.
They were all very young, still only about 20, and they wanted to make their mark. You know, they wanted it all: fame, riches, girls, whatever they could get.
And what they wanted was revolution. The Brotherhood was founded in 1848, when revolution of a different kind was spreading across Europe, and Karl Marx published his Communist Manifesto. Fired by the political turmoil around them, John Everett Millais and two fellow students at the prestigious Royal Academy School, William Holman Hunt, then aged 21, and Dante Gabriel Rosetti, 20, decided to overturn British art.
They all had a similar aim, and they were all rather dissatisfied with the teaching they were receiving at the academy. I think they wanted to work as part of a group and get inspiration from their peers.
They all agreed that during the early 19th century, British art had become lazy, predictable, and boring. So they sympathised with the art scholar John Ruskin when he complained of
the eternal brown cows in ditches, and white sails in squalls, and sliced lemons in sauces, and foolish faces in simpers.
It's important to remember that the Pre-Raphaelite group was interested in literature and poetry as much as visual art from the very start.
So, in a move to restore meaning to art, they decided to paint moral, significant subjects drawn from literature and the Bible. And they reversed the sterile academic tradition they had all been encouraged to emulate at the Royal Academy of form, colour and composition as embodied in the work of the 16th century artist Raphael. But as Hunt complained,
why should the composition be always apexed in pyramids? Why should the highest light always be on the principal figure? Why make one corner of the picture always in the shade?
Millais, Hunt and Rosetti set up a group that would offer an alternative to this academy dogma and recruited 4 other like-minded thinkers, including Rosetti's brother William, who wrote,
"We were really like brothers, continually together and confiding to one another, all experience bearing on questions of art and literature and many affecting us as individuals."
At one such meeting, Hunt brought along a book of engravings of the 15th century frescoes in the Campo di Santo at Pisa, art that predated Raphael. Here they saw no pyramid structure, no idealized subjects, but an attempt by an early Italian artist to capture life as it was. As Hunt said,
"It was probably the finding of this book which caused the establishment of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Millais, Rosetti and myself were all seeking some sure ground, some new starting point for our new art. Here at last was no trace of decline, no conventionality, no arrogance."
Notice it's not pre-Raphael. The word is actually pre-Raphaelite, so it means before the Raphaelites or the followers of Raphael. Now the idea here is that Raphael himself was a great artist of the High Renaissance just after the year 1500, but that his style had got conventionalized, made into a formula by his students and the next generations after that. Those are the Raphaelites, the followers, the imitators, and that's what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood is completely rejecting.
Millet's Christ in the house with his parents marked his attempt to portray a lifelike scene rather than an idealized one. With crisp detail and a composition that brushed away academy rules, it came as a complete shock to an unsuspecting public.
This painting was revolutionary on a number of levels. Firstly, when it appeared in public, it appeared completely audacious because of the way it was composed. It was seen to break all the rules of composing, great paintings. But coupled with that, you have this sort of an audacious realism. This is what was really shocking. And the idea is he's playing fast and loose with sacred imagery, and in doing so, he's really sticking his fingers up at the established way to present religious painting.
Millet's audacity is clear when his work is compared to that of one of his contemporaries. J.R. Herbert's picture of the same subject follows the Royal Academy's expectations with two simple groupings, Joseph and Mary on the right, and an angelic-faced Jesus isolated against the background on the left. Millet's, by contrast, was far less saccharine.
Millet was painting Christ like a street urchin. And I think what was also audacious was the attention to different body parts of the figures, rather than as in the Herbert painting, the faces being smooth, idealised, with no wrinkles or blemishes. Here you have sort of Joseph with his sunburnt hands, his veins protruding, his broken, dirty toenails. The figure of Christ too, you can see how his nails haven't been sort of cut. Mary, the veins in her hands, the swollen hands of St. Anne, as there'd been as a woman of that particular age. The blood actually looks real and sort of visceral. To get the sheep, making them look vivid in the background, he obtained sheep heads from a butcher's. So it's this real attention on all those areas you would normally edit out of a painting. The fact Millet has made a point of making them quite clear and apparent to the viewer, that was considered to be really audacious and shocking, quite blasphemous in a way. How dare you treat Jesus, or Christ, like that?
Shocking, too, were the technical aspects of Millet's work. The forensic detail of Millet's brushstrokes on the fur on John the Baptist's covering, in which every hair is separately shown, was unprecedented. The public were unused to this literal style. They had grown up on more painterly approaches, typified by artists such as Edward Landseer, who depicted fur, such as that on this donkey, with a uniform area of smooth brown using a large brush. But the press couldn't stomach Millet's almost photographic sense of detail.
The attempt to associate the Holy Family with no conceivable omission of misery, of dirt, and even disease is disgusting.
Such criticism was a novelty for Millet. He was the youngest ever student to enter the Royal Academy School at the age of 11, and became their star pupil. His affront to the institution that had nurtured him was therefore all the more shocking. Wanting to know what all the fuss was about, Queen Victoria sent to have the painting brought from the walls of the RA. I hope it will not have any bad effect on her mind, Millet joked. 22-year-old William Holman Hunt had entered the Academy after hard graft. From a trade background, he had faced parental opposition to his decision to be an artist. But in the same year as Millet's carpenter's shop, he exhibited an equally radical painting of early Roman missionaries converting a British family to Christianity. Critics were equally damning.
What had Mr. Hunt eaten for his supper when these incongruities came into his head? The British grapes have had their effect on both the missionaries, who seem to have suffered quite as much from this mistaken hospitality as from the Druids. We hope they had something better than British brandy to counteract the effect. We have lingered too long over this frantic trash.
Hunt, instead of using the traditional academy space, which involves having a sort of pyramid of a people with the most important person in the middle, sort of set slightly back into the canvas, he brings everything a long way forward, like a Roman piece of relief sculpture, which makes the painting modern in that you get this incredible intimacy. You feel incredibly part of the scene. A particularly compelling figure is this young lad here who's listening at the ground for the approach of footsteps, who looks straight out of us, and we really feel like we're on a level with him. At the same time, he uses the trick of 15th century paintings of dividing space up and having little apertures with secondary scenes in them to make the contrast between the mob and family, and to suggest perhaps another stage in this missionary's life, to suggest the danger that he might be in. This is one of my favourite passages in a painting by Hunt, where the water dribbles down and stains the earth and catches the light at the end. So you'll notice that the water stains the red earth, so it begins to take the appearance of spilt blood. So we get a suggestion that this missionary will also die, he'll also become a martyr. And most interestingly, here we have the first ever appearance in a Pre-Raphaelite painting of one of their most famous models, Lizzie Siddal, who would eventually appear in many of their paintings.
Elizabeth Eleanor Siddall was the daughter of a cutler who had been born in Sheffield. She was the second eldest in a large family. And the story goes that Lizzie was working as a milliner when she was spotted by Walter Deverell, who was a close buddy of the PRBs. I think Lizzie was taken up so enthusiastic because she was enthusiastic about modelling and posing for them and being with them. She obviously entered into the life of the studios very eagerly.
The third founding member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rosetti, was the son of a political refugee from Italy. A poet as well as a painter, the Bohemian Rosetti dropped out of the Royal Academy School, choosing instead to study with working painters. In 1850, he exhibited Ecce Ancilla Domini, otherwise known as the Annunciation.
One of the PRB principles was not just truth to nature, but to imagine how scenes from the past might actually have been like, to kind of imbue them with a lifelike quality. And so Rosetti is thinking, what could the Annunciation really have been like? The Virgin would not have been in a neoclassical arcade, as she's often depicted in Italian art. So Rosetti's imagining what it was like in Nazareth. So he's drawn her wearing a very simple shift rather than any elaborate costume. What's most striking about the painting is the foreshortening. So the spectator tumbles right into the picture space. There's no foreground distancing the viewer from the scene depicted. Mary's face comes forward to meet us in this very unusual and alarming way. And it sort of abandons, really, the true rules of perspective that artists normally followed, this dramatic foreshortening. And that's way before the post-impressionist challenge to perspective and framing. In addition to that, the Archangel Gabriel is not a winged creature in the traditional manner, but a very corporeal young man who's actually naked underneath his kind of gown. The only way he's depicted as an angel is that he's flying on flames under his feet. And one hand is allaying Mary's fear, and the other is thrusting the lily stem right at her womb, and that's the moment of conception.
And of course, Rosetti didn't escape the attention of the press either.
The face of the angel is insipidity itself.
As shocking as the art itself was the audacity of these painters forming a coherent self-styled movement. The first instance of artists with a manifesto in British art was met with horror.
Their ambition is an unhealthy thirst which seeks notoriety by way of good the eyes, which continues to rage with unabated absurdity among a class of juvenile artists who style themselves the PRB.
As Holman Hunt remarked,
the storm of abuse was now turned into a hurricane.
We hold them to be utterly heretical and damnable.
As an idiot counts the strokes of a clock.
the brothers suddenly found themselves at the centre of a national debate. But at the same time, they knew that outrage often provides the pathway to fame. And with this in mind, they moved on from their initial religious subjects to explore scenes of modern life.
We often think of the French Impressionists and painters of that generation as being the ones who were the first to produce compelling scenes of modern life in the modern city, the modern urban world. And a very famous point of reference is Charles Baudelaire's essay, published in 1863, The Painter of Modern Life, where he describes a painter who goes into the streets of the modern city and very rapidly captures the bustle, the excitement, the flurry of modern urban life. Now, what's interesting is that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were interested in exploring modern urban life a full decade before that.
At the heart of this was their fascination with the role of women in society. This was sometimes dressed up in historical guise, as in Millet's 1851 painting Mariana, where he explores women's dependence on marriage. The scene is drawn from a poem by Tennyson.
The Tennyson poems relate back to Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure, which describes this character, Mariana, whose dowry has been lost at sea. And as a result, she's been abandoned by her fiancé, Angelo. And she's sort of stranded in this moated grange and somehow lamenting her present-day existence. It's an image, really, of lassitude, ennui, and boredom and frustration. And she's at her table working on this embroidery, and she's put a pin down, almost in a gesture of frustration. And she's presented in this extraordinary pose with her sort of, hands on her back, so she's got backache. And that relates to not only the task she's been doing, but also it's an expression of her frustration and how, the agony she feels within. She's obviously desperate for a relationship, for fulfillment through marriage, and yet it's being denied to her. She's been compelled towards a nun-like existence. On the other hand, she desires sexual fulfillment. And her gaze is looking rather abstractly at the figure of the Archangel Gabriel on the stained glass window. Gabriel should really be looking at the figure of the Virgin Mary, but is actually looking askance at Mariana. And there are accounts of women in particular crowding round this picture and really sort of empathising with the figure of Mariana and her plight. There were more women than there were men at this particular time. So he, in a sense, is addressing a particular social issue through the subject from the past.
But Holman Hunt, bolder than Millet, felt no need to dress his subject up in medieval costume. He painted in the here and now, when in 1853 he looked at the role of the kept woman in The Awakening Conscience.
Prostitution was a big issue for debate at this time in Victorian London, especially amongst the middle classes who were concerned about its visibility in the city. And prostitutes also appeared as marginal figures in novels and in illustrations. But what is very different about The Awakening Conscience is that Hunt brings the prostitute centre stage. It's not a caricature of the prostitute, it's actually a portrait which looks into the psychology of her situation. So what we see is the young girl at the centre of the painting, together with her protector.
Hunt characteristically set up a very complex composition here, so that we actually see the window to the garden as it's reflected in a mirror on the back wall. So in a sense, he's giving us the whole view of the room, from the back wall with the mirror on it through to the view to the garden. Hunt is looking with fierce intensity at every detail of the modern scene. He's recording it all. It's like a historic documentation of a particular moment in time, and he's, in a sense, freezing that all in the picture for us.
It's a relationship which is based on beautiful things, on the apparent protectiveness of the man. But we see at the bottom of the painting a glove, a discarded glove, which I think is meant to imply that she will be discarded once he's finished with her. She has just jumped out of his lap. She has just understood that the life she's living is not the one she wants. She's understood the falseness of it. And we can see that under the table there is a cat imitating the pose of the man with his paw out. And a bird is trying to escape, trying to fly out of the window. And so we're left in some uncertainty as to whether she will escape. Prostitutes were understood to have a very set future, which involved a slow degradation and very often suicide. And I think that's linked to the fact that the model was not just a paid model, but somebody whose life Hunt was very interested in.
The model was Annie Miller, a working girl who Hunt found in a pub. They started an affair, and Hunt set Annie up in a boarding house and paid for her education. He intended to marry her, although he never kept his promise. The awakening conscience mirrored the relationships the Pre-Raphaelites were developing with their sitters. They were becoming increasingly attracted to working-class women, as both models and mistresses. As such, a kind of Pre-Raphaelite sisterhood formed, with them appearing in many of the paintings. Elizabeth Siddal, now Rosetti's mistress, was joined by Annie Miller, and then Fanny Cornforth, who sat for Rosetti's painting Found.
She's generally identified as a prostitute, but she's probably better described as a good-time girl. She was willing to go with any man who she fancied to supper rooms and dance halls. And she was certainly unescorted when Rosetti met her in the Thameside pleasure gardens and accidentally dislodged her bonnet and loosening a whole wealth of corn-coloured hair. She was a true stunner, and at once Rosetti took Fanny to his studio, positioned her head against the wall, and drew the careful study that forms the basis for the painting.
In Found, Rosetti paints the prostitute at her most desperate state, when the end of the road is near. It shows the fate of a former country girl laid low by urban vice. It's dawn in London. A countryman has come up to town to bring his calf for market. He spots his former sweetheart, who recoils in shame.
To underline the symbolic nature of the encounter, the poor little calf, which is on the way to slaughter, is held under a net, which is symbolic of the net that sin and shame have trapped the young woman in. The chief focus of the painting is the intertwined hands, which the Droville Carter is grasping the woman by her wrists, and she's pulling away, trying to wriggle out from his grasp.
Rosetti would continue to work on Found over many years, but eventually set it aside, unfinished. Within just a few years of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's foundation in 1848, they had achieved their aim of reforming British art. They had brought a new realism to the table. They had upturned the rules of composition. They introduced new painting techniques and new subject matters. But they were still critically damned, and they faced a bleak future. Their work didn't sell, and they were short of money. But then an unexpected saviour came along. John Ruskin, the author of Modern Painters, was a critic of almost unprecedented power in the art world, and at the vanguard of cultural thinking. He had kept quiet for 2 years, reading the abuse the Pre-Raphaelites had suffered in the press. But then he decided to put pen to paper in a letter to the Times to support the young rebels.
These Pre-Raphaelites will draw either what they see or what they suppose might have been the actual facts of the scene they desire to represent, irrespective of any conventional rules of picture-making.
When Ruskin's letter appeared in the Times, it was as if the the gods had come down from their Olympian heights and bestowed benefaction on the Pre-Raphaelites. Suddenly, they could do no wrong. Everyone knew that this man was quite extraordinary. Everyone trusted his eye and his judgment because his ideas were so fresh, exciting, and they really struck a chord with the Victorian public. So a word from John Ruskin was enough to make or break an artist.
They may, as they gain experience, lay in our England the foundations of a school of art nobler than the world has seen for 300 years.
This marked a turning point in the Pre-Raphaelites' fortunes. Now, with Ruskin's backing, the abuse in the press fell away. They could continue with their revolutionary ambitions, safe in the knowledge their future careers were secure. Despite all the hardships, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood had finally won the battle. British art would never be the same again.
And you can have your say about this or any of our programmes on the BBC4 website, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter.
Shall I play the second one? You want to see the last? It's a three-part. I can play one more.
Yes, yes, yes. And
Okay.
I think they were having a very good time.
I think so too. They don't get as much attention as the Impressionists, but they get these revolutionary, you know. But
They were wild boys.
So you might have said this already. Where does the name Pre-Raphaelite come from?
well, she said in the beginning that the art that happened after Raphael became more formalistic, post the late Renaissance, more stylized rules about composition, etc. And they wanted to, the early Renaissance, the 1400s, the beginning of the Renaissance is what they were interested in. It's like a freshness and a spirituality that was there, had gotten.
They were trying to go back to that.
Go back to that, yeah.
Thank you. That's enough.
That's the main thing, yeah. All right, part two. And this is three parts. If you want to watch the third part, it's on YouTube. It's just the Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Revolutionaries, BBC documentary.
The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood brought notoriety to British art in the 19th century. Bursting into the spotlight in the mid-century, they shocked their peers with a new kind of radical art. This programme explores how they began a new chapter in the history of art, transforming landscape painting with a microscopic examination of the natural world.
I think all artists working at this time would have been aware of natural history. So it was important that their paintings did reflect something of this interest and this curiosity about the natural world and wanting to understand it.
The idea of painting the landscape as it really is with a kind of scientific fidelity was at the heart of this.
By 1850, the Industrial Revolution was at its height, coinciding with the revolution that was taking place in British art. The Pre-Raphaelites' founding members, John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rosetti, had created a critical storm by bringing a new realism to British art. And now, with the expanding rail network offering quick travel to the countryside, they ventured outside London and turned their attention to a landscape that had only just become accessible to them. Painting all details outside was new and predated the Impressionists by 10 years. Traditionally, landscape painting was executed in the studio from sketches, but the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group who embraced experimentation. Although embarking on such an excursion demanded preparation. First, they had to prepare their paints. powdered coloured pigments were ground with a glass muller, then mixed together with an oil-based matter. The paint was then put into a pig's bladder for transportation. They would then have to find protection against any inclement weather conditions. Only then could they pack their easels and canvases and board the train. Millet and Hunt in particular were eager to paint what was real with a new microscopic precision. So in 1851, they took advantage of the South East Rail Line extension and set off for Surrey, with Millet deciding on Hogsmill River for the setting of his picture. It was to become one of the most famous paintings in British art, and one that transformed the landscape genre. Ophelia.
It's based on Shakespeare's play Hamlet, on the scene where Gertrude, Queen Gertrude, describes the tragic death of Ophelia. Ophelia is Hamlet's betrothed. She's been rejected by him, and after the death of Polonius, her father, she's been driven out of her mind. And it shows her sort of pathetic and tragic death when she's singing songs, gathering flowers, slips into a brook, and is dragged by the weight of her garments underneath the waters to her murky depth. It goes against the rules of composing pictures. Usually we read images, in the West from sort of left to right, but of course the flow of the river here is from right to left. So he's actually doing something sort of quite counterintuitive in a way, and perhaps in doing so, he's inviting us to look at this image as being a very disturbing image, which indeed it is. He was the first artist to actually show Ophelia in the process of drowning. Millet was quite concerned to relay the natural elements to the story of Ophelia. So a lot of attention has been sort of spent on the natural specimens at Ewell. So the dog Rose, that obviously alludes to the rose in the Gertrude's speech. You also have the long purples Shakespeare refers to, indicated here by this sort of loose stripe on the right-hand side. You have these daisies scattered in the composition. So he obviously starts off with Shakespeare's text, but goes beyond that to include flowers, which really relate symbolically to the plight of Ophelia. Professor of botany thought it was better to teach botany to his students from Millet's painting of Ophelia than it wasn't taking them on a field trip into the country. It's so accurate and precise was his depiction of these natural phenomena. So you could actually read this in sort of as a pre-Darwinian image, really, that it's a struggle for existence. All these plants here are struggling for survival on this riverbank. Ophelia is one of these specimens, but being the weaker of the species, she is doomed to die rather than survive. So he's obviously looking at sort of human history, even though it's a pre-Darwinian image.
Once Millet had painted all landscape, he went back to London to sketch the figure of Ophelia. This in itself reversed the normal practice. His model was the 19-year-old Elizabeth Siddal, who had already posed for a number of Pre-Raphaelite pictures. Lizzie posed for Millet lying in a tin bath, heated by just a few candles. But so preoccupied was he that he didn't notice when the candles went out. Afraid to mention anything, Lizzie remained in the pose, getting numb with cold. It was the last time she sat for Millet. But despite this, the painting was exhibited to huge acclaim.
Ophelia is a really important painting for Millet because it really marks the breaking point from being a sort of, enfant terrible, someone who's desecrated by the critics, the subject of opprobrium. Suddenly, people see this picture and they think, wow, this artist is doing something completely new and different. But rather than alienating his audience, he's eliciting the sympathy of the spectator. And there's a wonderful review of this painting by Tom Taylor in Punch. He said it brings tears to his eyes, that he is an artist who has actually managed to make dying beautiful.
Just as Millet was examining the landscape with the eye of a camera, William Holman Hunt was also applying his own detailed vision of the natural world in a field close by, painting The Hireling Shepherd. Hunt was keen to get a sense of the luminosity of nature as it actually looked under the vivid sun. To achieve this, he departed from the norm of painting onto a dark backing by preparing his canvas with a white ground. This had the effect of illuminating the colours far more brightly. He would then use a very fine brush, more like a watercolour brush, to paint the minute detail. Every blade of grass, each eyelash. Such precision would often mean only an inch of canvas could be completed in a day. This scrutiny and demanding work chimed with the Victorian obsession with technological progress and scientific thinking, which was eagerly promoted by the art critic and ardent geologist, John Ruskin.
Ruskin said quite simply that you should go to nature in all singleness of heart, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and believing always in the truth. So the idea of painting the landscape as it really is, with a kind of scientific fidelity, was at the heart of this.
Ruskin saw how Millet's scientific fidelity had achieved a sense of majesty in its detail. So he commissioned him to paint his portrait. But this was to be no ordinary portrait. Under Ruskin's guidance, Millet was to turn his formidable technical skill in painting the detail of the Scottish landscape. Historic landscape painting, as Ruskin called it.
So off they all went. This is Ruskin, his wife, Effie, who he'd married in 1848, same time as the Brotherhood was formed, and Millet, and Millet's brother, William Henry, who was also a painter, and, of course, Ruskin's manservant, Crawley. They all went up together, and they stayed in this tiny, and I mean tiny, little sort of farmhouse, really, at the little village of Brigg O'Turk in Glenfinlas, in the Trossachs.
At Brigg O'Turk, Ruskin and Millet found the perfect site. At the bottom of a steep ravine, a stream ran over some ancient rocks. The view had no horizon. This in itself would be an innovation in landscape portraiture, but would give Millet the setting to which he could turn his camera's eye.
I think one of the reasons why Ruskin was attracted to this particular site was because of the rock. The rocks he was passionate about, what he called the slaty crystallines, the prime example of which was this nice rock. He loved this because of its banding, its foliation, how it was composed of different minerals. So it's quite interesting how he wants to be associated with it in this portrait. The idea that this rock has this ennobling effect. So he's presented in the portrait standing on the rock. The idea that there are parallels between the two, between his steadfast, fixed gaze and the firmness of the rock. So the idea is the rocks are to be sort of read in sort of ethical or moral terms.
And whilst Millet painted the details of the landscape, Ruskin, a very fine draftsman and watercolour artist in his own right, sketched the rock in the background of the portrait, keeping a watchful eye on what Millet was doing.
So Ruskin sort of, focuses in on a patch of rock in the distance. And it's quite interesting comparing the way the two artists approach this. Millet is obviously fascinated with the surface. He attends to the lichen on the rocks, the textural patterns. But I think Ruskin is far more interested in the structure, the sort of, the gneissic banding. And it's interesting how he picks out these quartz veins in the rock, which you don't get in Millet's composition. So he's really, as an artist, he's far more aware of how these rocks have been formed. The movement of water and how they came to being years and years ago through the sort of molten rock, cooled and hardened as part of this particular process. Ruskin was very keen on this portrait. He obviously saw it as being a collaborative process. He was instructing Millet in geology, and in turn, Millet was instructing him about painting out of doors.
The relationship between Millet and Ruskin was not the only one developing during this painting holiday. Whilst living together in the confined space of the little cottage, Millet discovered he was falling in love with Ruskin's wife, Effie. When she revealed that despite 5 years of marriage, she was still a virgin, Millet, at first shocked, began to see an opportunity for them to be together, evident in some of his sketches of the time.
So we bought this rather beautiful drawing here, which is of angels forming a Gothic arch. And of course they're Effie. We took the back off that drawing to get it conserved. And on the back, hidden since the 1850s, was that. Instead of two angels, are Millet and Effie caressing. I suppose it's wishful thinking, but it's very beautiful.
Well, not so wishful. A year after the Scottish trip, Effie attained an annulment to her marriage on the grounds of non-consummation with Ruskin. And in 1855, she married Millet.
And the relationship between Ruskin and Millet, that also changed, really. Millet couldn't stand the sight of him, and he couldn't understand why Ruskin was almost supine in the face of all these accusations. The only spark that Ruskin showed was when the marriage was being annulled. He offered to prove to the court, bizarrely, his manhood. And it's very difficult to imagine how he could have done that. But he offered it. I've no idea. It would have been fascinating if the judge had said, yes, Ruskin, I think you really should.
Such public humiliation made any future working relationship between Ruskin and Millet impossible. So Ruskin, perhaps for spite, diverted his patronage to the third founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rosetti. Ruskin was much taken with Rosetti's watercolour, the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice, Dante drawing The Angel, painted in 1853. Rosetti's interests were diverging from those of his fellow brothers. While they were pursuing realism, the earlier Pre-Raphaelite interest in medievalism was dominating his work. Ruskin offered Rosetti first refusal on all his works, which freed him from the need to exhibit. He also offered Rosetti's mistress, the Pre-Raphaelite model Lizzie Siddal, featured in Dante drawing an angel, an annual income in support of her own ambitions to become an artist.
Elizabeth Siddal was just over a year younger than Rosetti. So she had been working, I think, in the fashion trades for quite a few years before she became the PRB's sort of favourite model. And she posed for a whole sequence of paintings by other members of the group. And then she went to pose for Rosetti, and at that moment her own dreams began to be realised, because she turned out she had artistic ambitions of her own. And at this moment, Rosetti transformed Lizzie from an ordinary model into his sweetheart and his student. He believed that Lizzie's talent was best served by allowing her to draw and paint in the naive manner without any instruction, which explains why her drawings have a very childlike character. They're very intensely emotional, but the drawing, and particularly the anatomy, is very primitive.
And whilst Rosetti and Lizzie explored the medieval fantasy world, the other members of the Pre-Raphaelites continued with their fascination of the burgeoning sciences of Victorian Britain.
I think all artists working at this time would have been aware of natural history. And because the text they would have been aware of would have been Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which was widely read, and was really a wonderful survey of geological formations and structures in the British Isles. And I think they wanted to be part of that culture. They were modern British artists after all. They were painting for a contemporary audience. So it was important that their paintings did reflect something of this interest and this sort of curiosity about the natural world and wanting to understand it.
Holman Hunt's curiosity led him to board the train down to Hastings in 1852 to paint a stretch of land that scientists were beginning to classify as a prime example of coastal erosion. He showed it in his painting Our English Coasts, or Lost Sheep, as it's also known.
Geological formations of this coastline, and it's not a grand, magnificent cliff like Dover Cliffs. It's actually a piece of collapsing coastline, and so the actual geology of the rock seems to express the anxiety that we see in the Lost Sheep. And this very much relates to research that's going on in this time into geology. Our English Coast depicts these extraordinary cliffs at Covehouse Bay near Hastings and assembles sheep at the very brink of these cliffs as a metaphor for what is going on in Britain at this time. This is exactly the moment when Napoleon III has come to power in Paris, when there is a feeling that there might be a renewal of the hostilities of the Napoleonic Wars. And Hunt expresses this idea with the idea of the lost sheep, the sheep standing precariously at the edge of the cliff. And Hunt stresses the modernity of that scene with the tiny little steamship which travels across the horizon in the background, so that he turns the landscape, with all the extraordinary detail of the landscape, into a much richer picture that becomes a kind of condition of England picture. We see one sheep here who's caught in the brambles and who looks straight at us in a kind of appealing way, very typical technique of Hunt to get us involved in the painting. We see the shadows, a blue shadow lengthening across the green fields in the background in a slightly ominous manner. The painting is painted at the end of the day to add to the atmosphere. We can even see the light coming through this sheep's ear.
Capturing such naturalistic light effects also interested another painter associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, Ford Maddox Brown, in his painting of 1852, Pretty Bar Lambs.
So he takes up some of the Pre-Raphaelite ideas about responding to nature, and he applies his own particular interest in light effects. He doesn't just paint the landscape out of doors, he actually poses his figures out of doors and paints the entire scene so that there's consistent conditions of light, bright sunlight over the figure as well as the landscape. Now, as far as I know, that's actually the first time this has been done in painting. So Ford Maddox Brown's actually doing something really novel by making his model stand out in the hot sunshine. You can see her cheeks are pretty red. The painting is the first to represent figures in the open air and in the conditions of sunlight that are particular to a specific moment, that is really the middle of the day. Another way in which it's the first is actually observing all of the details, such as the colored shadow. The baby is holding a little sprig of foliage which casts a blue shadow on its white dress. Again, this is an innovation that is definitely observed from nature. Shadows are colored, they're not just dark. He's not painting according to the rules of painting. He's actually painting by fresh, new observation of what's before his eyes. That, I think, is the idea behind it being a new chapter, a new event in the history of art.
Ford.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to end it here. It's 3:57. There's 5 more minutes of that. But, and then, like I said, there is one more episode. So that was good, wasn't it? I learned a lot.
Yeah, those were great. I learned a lot from those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So
You always bring new, beautiful information. Thank you.
yeah, and you can really see the influence on the Impressionists, but they don't get the credit, like I said. But also, also some of the ideas of modern art is strong outdoor contrast and putting people in sunlight and strong contrast and just creating the time of day. Yeah. All right. So 2 weeks. I'm not sure how I'll do in 2 weeks, but come up with somebody. Maybe it's time for Salvador Dali, possibly.
That's good.
There's a really good documentary about him. Yeah.
This was great, Joe. Thank you.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah. Good to see you again, children. All right. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.